So you want to read and be able to understand the book of Revelation. Sounds good. This can be one of the hardest books of the Bible to make sense of because of the way that it uses vivid imagery and confusing language sometimes. So, as we begin to understand what Revelation is saying, first, join me in some imagination. It's a beautiful, clear day as you stroll alongside Central Park in New York City. The bustle of the city is all around you, and the sounds of a public concert, your destination, ring out across the hubbub of the world around you. While standing at a crosswalk, you notice a young man taking pictures of the opening of a new bodega, while a red-haired journalist interviews the smiling owner. The young man has a Daily Bugle name badge that reads P. Parker, Staff Photographer. You're not sure why that catches your attention on such a beautiful day, but you don't have long to think about it, because suddenly an explosion shakes the street and rattles the windows. You whip around to see terrified patrons screaming and running away from the concert, and musicians pick one another up to flee as fire engulfs the stage. You dive for cover in the new bodega as explosions ring out all across the street. It looks like bright orange pumpkin bombs are bursting into flame all over, and maniacal laughter rings out from above. Can the itsy bitsy spider come out to play? Says a cruel voice from above, and you look up to see what looks like a green man in a terrifying goblin costume streak across the sky on a jet-powered glider, hurling his destructive pumpkin bombs and cackling at the carnage. You look around in fear, but notice the red-haired journalist is smiling as she looks off into the distance. She's braver than that scrawny photographer P. Parker, or whatever his name was, because he's nowhere to be seen. He must have run away from all the trouble. But you can't spare much time for that thought, because someone on the street cries out, "Look, it's Spider-Man!" And, well, you guess that's as good a name as any for what you're seeing, because in the air above the street, you now see a man swinging through the air on what looks like spider webs. He's wearing red and blue tights and swinging from building to building, shooting webs from his wrists. And suddenly, he's locked in battle, dueling it out with the Green Goblin, who's wreaking havoc across the street. The fight is fierce, but the Goblin is no match for the amazing Spider-Man. Thwip, pow, kaboom, thwip, 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 thwip. And just like that, the fight's over. Like a fly caught in a trap, the Goblin is wrapped up in webs, hanging upside down from a street lamp. Spider-Man surveys the scene of his victory from his perch atop a crosswalk sign and says to the defeated villain, "You feeling okay, Gobby? You're looking a little green." He chuckles to himself as the first responders pull up to the scene, and with one loud thwip, you watch from the broken window of the brand new bodega as the one they call Spider-Man swings away. Now, all that just sounds crazy, right? Spider people swinging on webs and flying green goblins with pumpkin bombs? That kind of stuff doesn't exist. Even while places like New York or Central Park or bodegas do exist in a world with photographers and reporters and musicians. Even in the midst of this, I imagine that most of you picked up on exactly what was happening in this story, even if you aren't the most devoted of comic book fans. Because this is a story of the superhero Spider-Man, of course. These unbelievable things are not so novel in the fictional world of comics. Our minds understand that when we pick up a Marvel or DC comic book, we'll likely encounter superheroes and supervillains alongside the everyday ordinary stuff of life. We allow the wild and supernatural stuff to be normal in these settings because that's just part of the genre of comic book stories, and we allow the comics to teach us important lessons. The most famous line in Spider-Man is a lesson that the young Peter Parker learns from his Uncle Ben, that with great power there must also come great responsibility. Understanding responsibility and sacrifice are key themes throughout all of Spider-Man's comics and movies. It's an important lesson for any comic book fan to learn. We all have gifts and power in our life, even if it doesn't manifest in spidey sense and wall crawling and firing webs, and we all have to learn how to embrace the responsibility towards others that comes with any measure of power we hold. But Spidey isn't alone in teaching important lessons. The X-Men, mutants with superpowers, serve as an allegory for various marginalized groups facing discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sexuality, or other factors. Wonder Woman is an iconic feminist superhero who lifts up themes of female empowerment, gender equality, and the fight against misogyny and sexism. And while Captain America often shines a challenging light on the wide distance between the aspirational values and actual lived experience of American ideals, that's just what these stories do. Comic book readers dive into fantastic and wild stories, and suspending their disbelief and sense of literalism for the sake of the genre, they can learn important lessons through an accessible medium. But perhaps comics aren't really your cup of tea. You prefer something like a classic samurai-style space western / opera called Star Wars, where young Luke Skywalker is taught by Obi-Wan Kenobi of the living force that binds the galaxy and gives Luke the power to be a Jedi. Luke then joins the rebellion in a struggle against the evil Empire and the dreaded Darth Vader, culminating in Luke using the Force to destroy the planet-killing space station, the Death Star. It's the classic good versus evil story, with clear, heroic good guys on the side of the rebellion and clear bad guys on the side of the Empire. But did you know that George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, envisioned this story in many ways as a commentary on the Vietnam War and the dangerous trajectory of American imperialism? Lucas actually envisioned the rebellion like the Viet Cong and the United States as the empire. That would be a very challenging point for many Americans to accept at face value. But Star Wars offered a medium by which people might be willing to hear this critique. The Empire in Star Wars tends to respond with massive military onslaughts, resembling America's frustrated efforts to quell the Vietnamese insurgency. It's an unflattering mirror to hold to ourselves as a nation. Ultimately, just as the vast technological superiority of American imperialism met its downfall in the Vietnam War at the hands of guerrilla tactics that many considered primitive by the Viet Cong, George Lucas's vision of the Empire fell on Endor at the hands of technologically inferior teddy bears called the Ewoks. A not-so-subtle conclusion to his trilogy of social commentary. Again, hearing that your country is the bad guy in a conflict is not something easy to hear when said directly. But Star Wars uses obvious references to Nazi Germany with the Imperial officers' SS-like uniforms and the Stormtrooper moniker from the Empire for the Empire's grunt soldiers. There was no way of ignoring who was the bad guy. But offering this criticism through the medium of a science fantasy world of lightsabers, Wookiees, and Jar Jar Binks might just make the conversation easier to understand and open a door for understanding to someone whose biases may have clouded their judgment. So, when someone uses dramatic imagery in a fantasy story like this, it's important to remember that the creator of the story actually did have a point and wouldn't want it to be interpreted a different way. Because if you somehow miss all the signs in Star Wars that point to the Empire equals bad and rebels equal good, then you could easily twist the narrative to make a very different point. Willfully disregarding the deeper point of the creator, one could say that Star Wars films are actually the story of the radicalization of Luke Skywalker. From introducing him to us in A New Hope as a simple farm boy gazing into the Tatooine sunset, to his eventual transformation into the radicalized insurgent of Return of the Jedi, as one who sets his own father's corpse on fire and celebrates the successful bombing of the second Death Star. Each film in the original trilogy is another step in Luke's descent into terrorism. By carefully looking at the same signs that governments and scholars use to detect radicalization today, we can witness Luke's dark journey into religious fundamentalism and extremism happen before our very eyes. Luke is the kind of isolated, disaffected young man that terrorist recruiters seek out. We see Obi-Wan Kenobi, a religious fanatic with a history of recruiting youth and teaching an extreme and rigid interpretation of the Force. When he stumbles upon Luke, Kenobi knows he's found a prime candidate for radicalization. In our modern world, terror groups place a focus on depluralization, or stripping away the recruit's membership from all groups and isolating them to increase their susceptibility to terrorist messaging. Within moments of meeting Luke, Obi-Wan tells Luke he must abandon his family and join him, going so far as telling a shocking lie that the Empire killed Luke's father, hoping to inspire Luke to a life of religious extremism. The perfect catalyst is found when a routine Tatooine home inspection goes terribly wrong, and after the Empire's accidental harming of Luke's Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen, Obi-Wan preys upon Luke's emotional state to take him under his spell towards a life of extremism. Obi-Wan whisks Luke off of Mos Eisley using a Jedi mind trick to bypass security, knowing full well he likely appears on numerous terror no-fly lists. After contracting a local drug smuggler for transportation, Obi-Wan and his newest Skywalker recruit are off. After instigating a riot in an Imperial Public Works space station sent to investigate the inexplicable appearance of the new Alderaanian asteroid belt, Luke escapes and regroups with a terror sleeper cell when he joins them on an attack mission. As he nears his target, he hears the martyred Obi-Wan's words in his mind. Luke closes his eyes, says a prayer, and bombs a space station, killing millions of souls stationed aboard. Young Skywalker proves himself a quick study in the ways of armed religious extremism. Now, that's obviously not the point that Star Wars was making, and you had to really stretch to willfully not see the evil of the Empire in this story. But this kind of interpretation that ignores the heart of the author is all too common when striving to interpret the meaning behind this kind of storytelling and social critique that we find in the genres of science fiction, fantasy, and other works of artistic fiction. But wait, why are we still talking about comic books and Star Wars? Wasn't this whole conversation supposed to be about the book of Revelation? Yes, it was, and still is. Are we still talking about this because Pastor Alex is just a big nerd? Probably. But all of this is leading us here to an important point, that if you can understand something like the story of Spider-Man and how it can teach us about a particular set of morals, values, and ways of interacting with the world, and something wild, silly, and fantastic as Star Wars can actually serve as a really cutting commentary about the dreadful trajectory of totalitarianism and how America herself is not immune to the allure of imperialism, then I believe we can begin to understand the book of Revelation. While we've already examined other longer stretches of Scripture that involve multiple books, Revelation stands unique as a book that is, in its totality, a genre of writing called apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is unlike anything else we've read in the Bible so far, even though other portions of Scripture dabbled into apocalypse-style writing in small parts, like Daniel and some of the Gospels. It's actually a really good thing that Revelation comes last in the Bible, because we need to understand the rest before we can really enter into what this book is saying. Apocalyptic literature was very popular in the historic period that Revelation was written, and the stories often used violence in the realm of great cosmic battles to make their point. And they used rich symbolism and dramatic images that might seem more at home in one of our more modern comic books or sci-fi films. While there may be no green goblins or Jedi in the book of Revelation, this apocalyptic writing draws on many otherworldly images, such as the beast, the dragon, sea monsters, the seven trumpets, swords coming from the mouth of God, and much more, in order to teach readers important lessons about God's faithfulness in the midst of persecution, and offer brilliant and faithful critiques of Roman imperial power. And in the same way that it was important to remember the original intent of George Lucas in creating Star Wars, so that we don't ignore the Empire's evil and wildly miss the point, when we read Revelation, we need to remember everything else we know about God through Scripture before reading the vivid and dramatic imagery of this apocalyptic literature, and find ourselves thinking that the God of grace, resurrection, and new life is suddenly all about a violent bloodlust that divides and destroys the world rather than heals and redeems. Just because the original writers wrote this in a style that sounds much more like a comic book or sci-fi movie doesn't mean we get to disregard everything we know about who God is. So, my argument is a simple one. Apocalyptic literature is much more like a comic book than any other book of the Bible. And that's a really helpful thing to remember in order to make sense of this unique genre. Using the lens of Spider-Man and Star Wars and understanding what those stories can teach us, we can apply that same lens to Revelation and find meaning for this often challenging book.